This is House Planning Help episode 365. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Cypren Edmunds, President of the European Straw Building Association, Chairperson at Straw Bale UK, and he also works at the Sustainable Traditional Building Alliance. So we're obviously going to be talking about straw and bio-based materials, but interestingly, there's a story that leads him there, and it's through housing activism. So we're always looking ahead with the podcast and planning our next few episodes, and that's certainly what I'm doing at the moment. So I wanted to do a quick shout out. What are the topics that you would like to know about? Well, get in touch with me through the website at houseplanninghelp.com. You have contact pages there or on social media, and just let me know what challenges you're facing, and then we can address those challenges with future podcasts. If you're one of our hub members, we can create content in there to help you. But it's just always helpful to have that conversation, and also interesting to know what you're up to, what you're doing on your own project. Let's get to our featured interview with Cypren Edmonds. Most of what we do on this podcast is about private one-off projects, be they new build or retrofit. However, we cover all sorts of housing-related topics. And what if you find yourself living in social housing and there are problems? Condensation, damp, mould. It's a familiar story. Well, this is exactly what Cypren Edmonds had to contend with. So not only do we find out how he and his community address these challenges, but it's a life lesson that something good can come out of stepping forward, having a positive attitude, and just thinking through what options are available to us. So we'll talk about straw, we'll also talk about housing activism, and I started by asking Cypren to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about where he lives.
My name is Cypren Edmonds. I live and reside in Wimbledon, South London. Have lived here for over 30 years. And I live on a social housing estate. I have been a housing activist for half of that time, I would say, mainly because of the state of the homes. It's a 654 home estate that is presently undergoing a regeneration.
What was it that drove you to decide and to even call yourself a housing activist?
Principally, the sentiment and the feeling of residents on this estate was that they had nowhere to turn to in terms of the upkeep of their homes. The local authority were indifferent as to how they were going to renovate and look after their homes. Many people found, as much as the case is now, unfortunately, that they just couldn't keep up with what the ongoing projects were delivering. So their homes weren't being sustained to the level that they would have wanted. And this has come about because of the fabric of the buildings that they live in, and also because of the overcrowding. So I felt, I myself was in that position. I was living in a property that had damp and condensation. It was really becoming quite distressing for me and my family. And we decided to reignite the Residents Association principally. From there, I realized that the Residents Association, whilst it had a lot of frustration and anger deep within it, what we weren't able to do was to get into the core of what really mattered. None of us, I suppose, besides myself, were involved in the built environment. I'm a qualified carpenter, but I wasn't practicing carpentry at the time. But none of us, knew anything about planning or regulations or anything of that nature. So I just took it upon myself to leave the career that I was in at the time, which was fitness training. I was really losing quite a bit of faith within the fitness sector, if I'm honest with you. I didn't really like the direction which it was going. And I thought, right, I'm just going to dive into this, literally just dive into it. And it was from there, having spoken to a number of councillors and Members of parliament in my community just decided, right, just crack on and get on with this and try and find a way.
It's a slightly different boat to being in a private property that you own, that you can maintain, that you can make changes to. So, from the housing association, when you are in one of their properties, you're talking about damp and mold. Do you have any rights there?
Well, yes, to quite a large degree you do, because if you're a social tenant, as opposed to, as you've just pointed out, a private one, then it's up to the housing association, who in effect are the landlords of the properties, to maintain and upkeep the fabric of those sites, of those buildings. So you can protest and complain about it, and they will undertake the work necessary.
But you've got to live there at the moment, haven't you? That's the trouble.
You do, yeah, we do. And unfortunately, because it's that statement that you've just thrown up has just put up a lot of questions in my head, or a lot of statements in my brain, because it typifies what's happening within society on the whole, because we don't have enough skilled professionals in the construction sector to undertake the kind of work necessary, whether that's from the lowest level, for want of a better word or term, the labourers, and even if we're going to the highest level, sufficient people who can understand the requirements to retrofit. So you're stuck between both of those two elements as a resident, and you're hoping and crossing everything to hope that they will undertake the work properly, but it doesn't seem to happen on a large scale. Yes, you will find a few properties which have been refurbished, but not in the manner in which it should have been.
And we're talking about ventilation for a large part here, and I'm just envisaging other people in a similar circumstance. They can just see themselves there. Was it ever thrown back at you that actually this is your problem, that you're maybe doing too many activities, generating moisture, drying your clothes
Yes.
in there? You deal with it.
Yes, how dare you wash and clean yourself, or wash and clean your clothes? And I think this goes back to the argument about the over-occupation, if you like, because on some instances, you've got multi-generation occupancy, the grandparents, the mother and father, and the children. So that was one statement, or one premise, which was being thrown back to you. In fact, it was thrown back to me in the very early stages of my occupancy of my flat when I moved in. We had someone come round and visit. He was a surveyor. I'm not entirely sure if he was a qualified surveyor, but he said he was. But he certainly worked for the housing association. And he pointed out that, you can't do this, you can't do that. He wasn't being crude or horrible about it, but it just did make you wonder, well, then how are you supposed to dry your clothes? How are you supposed to have a bath? How does the moisture escape and move within these four walls? And he wasn't able to supply a sufficient answer. The only one he could give was just to leave your window ajar. And also at the time, the other thing I need to add is that there are three tower buildings on the estate. You had fan heating, you didn't have radiators. So moisture was just filtering around the properties like anything. And the thing that really triggered me into really having a Bob Geldof moment, in Live Aid, I think you're old enough to remember that, where where he slams the coffee table and says, "Give us your money now," to people at home who were maybe withholding their coppers, was when somebody said to me on my estate, we'd had a meeting, and they said, "You need to go and visit this man who lives in your block," funnily enough. And I'd seen him walking around and about, but I hadn't realized what conditions he was living under. And he didn't refer to it. He never mentioned it or complained to his neighbours. He'd made complaints to the local authority and to the housing association, but not to the neighbours. And I went to visit him, and he was standing, I'll never forget it, he was standing by the front door of his property, and literally, I kid you not, there was a light bulb above his head, next to his front door, and water was dripping through the light bulb and falling onto his head as he was talking to me. And when you walked throughout his flat, you can see every single wall was just dripping with condensation and mold. It typified some of the worst cases. I'll never forget. I'd really entrenched myself to such an extent that I was literally door knocking on a lot of the homes on the estate, and seeing some of the homes was just horrific. And I think at that point, in fact, before then, the housing association, because they'd done quite a significant amount of surveying, they realized how bad this was. So they said, look, we can't undertake a significant refurbishment, or as we call it now, retrofit, because it would just be too costly. So the option we voted for was a regeneration.
Just sticking with this moisture issue, is there a quick fix? For example, what happens if we open the window and just keep it open? Does that do anything?
Well, no, not really. No, it just makes it worse, if anything at all, because we have to consider we live in a city. Most people who live in London are not used to sleeping with their windows slightly ajar. So what we're talking about is a cultural issue. If you go to the countryside, you talk to people who live in their traditional heritage homes. Some of these people are very happy to leave their windows slightly ajar. And it's not necessarily from the security perspective, but they're just used to being out and about because they live a very different lifestyle, I suppose. Some may be farmers, they're quite content in doing that. But within London, most people are used to closing all the doors and used to closing all of the windows to ensure that their homes are well insulated, quote unquote. Thinking, right, okay, if they don't have any drafts coming through, that it will keep the property warm and they won't have to heat the property at a higher cost. So it comes down to education and culture.
I'm feeling quite emotional about this, and I'm trying to put my finger on exactly why. Maybe it's the helplessness of this situation, that even if, let's say, your housing association had the best scheme organised, this is just not an overnight fix. And you talked about the cultural change of doing things. Maybe you could bring in a dehumidifier as well, but none of these solutions sound good.
They don't. And, just to refer back to my case, and in fact, there are other cases on the estate who have this. Again, another solution that was proposed was to have a dehumidifier, and they wheeled that into my property. But then you've got this noisy contraption in the corner with a hope that that will resolve things. I mean, I think with the best will in the world, and I say this humbly, I think they did feel that this was the best way to move forward. It didn't work, and it wasn't going to work because of the materials that we were living within. Concrete and steel are not the best materials to maneuver around when it comes to moisture.
So your housing activism, was it really for the bigger picture? I'm sure you're having an impact where you live, but it sounds like that's a slow burner and you may not get exactly what you want.
Yes, it is. It is essentially because there are many strands that come off it, really. So, with regards to the regeneration, for example, we didn't take the line that many other housing estates, certainly in London, had taken, where you were literally marching the streets with pitchforks and flames. We really genuinely wanted to work with the housing association, the local authority. I felt that trying to get a level minded or even minded understanding as to what was happening on the estate would really try to scope out what was happening, broadly speaking. So when I started work with Sustainable Traditional Building Alliance, albeit it's a different archetype, some would argue that the housing estates or the blocks on my housing estates are traditional. They go back to the 50s, but we're talking 1920s and before when it comes to traditional and heritage homes. I felt that the wider picture really needed to encapsulate the wider engagement. So when we were consulted on the regeneration, for example, you had a multitude, and I'm talking about a multitude of facts and information, which many people on the estate didn't understand the wider picture other than what and how it affected them. So we had consultation delivered from the housing association, and within, I think, another week or two, you had a consultation from the local authority. Some people, and I would argue some people still even to this day, feel that the local authority still own the housing estates. They don't. It's owned by the housing association. So the wider level of understanding needs to be addressed, and the politics of all of that needs to be addressed as well, because you then get mixed messages from different political parties, and that can confuse a lot of people, the layman. And I say this humbly for those people who are working 9 to 5 or even longer hours than 9 to 5, who do not have the time to really dig in through these documents, which, if I'm honest with you, are so detailed, you would need a significant amount of time to understand what they really were telling you. So when it comes to housing activism, I would say that from my perspective and my involvement in it, it really entails the wider picture when it comes to community engagement, as well as the understanding of building materials.
So you've mentioned a few things that the housing activism has done. One thing that I don't quite understand is, were you able to commit time to going through all these details, or were you able to be connected to people who could help you decipher what was going on? How did that help?
Well, I had to make the time. I still do it now as a volunteer. A significant proportion of my time is undertaken voluntarily. Sometimes you're not going down rabbit holes, but what you do find, and what I have found, experience has taught me to really sort out the wheat from the chaff. I didn't mean to put that pun in there for straw, but yes, you have to.
You want me to ask you a question about straw, don't you?
Yeah. Oh, well, that's a lovely segue. Yeah, yeah, you do find some people just like to talk for the sake of talking, and they love the sound of their own voice, and for the sake of their own vanity projects. And you then find out through experience, who to go to and who not to go to.
And one more question just on the housing associations. So you mentioned about trying to work with them, that's always going to have the best outcome. Any more tips in that? Because clearly you have some goals as well.
Yeah, keeping the lines open. And I think I've done relatively well in doing that. Having an open mind to their ideas. What will make you and others laugh is the fact that, in relation to straw, the director of the Housing Association for this particular regeneration has actually delivered a straw building. He built a community centre with straw bales many moons ago before he joined this organisation. So when I referred it to him in terms of why don't we regenerate the estates with straw, he said, "Oh, right, yes, I understand what that is. I know what you mean, blah, blah, blah. But we can't do that." And this is before Grenfell. Okay, so discounting all of the misconceptions regarding fire. And it's mainly due to the level of knowledge that we have in this country about it, and the misconceptions.
So how did you branch out? You've mentioned straw already, so I know that's significant. But yeah, how do we move from what's happening right in front of you to this bigger picture, and what do you do today?
On a wider level, on a much bigger level, I'm a president for the European Straw Building Association. I chair the UK association, so Straw Bale UK. And the wider aspect of that, it's really getting the message across politically, digging into the policy and the regulations. So with the European Straw Building Association, we have national associations who are really doing very much a great job when it comes to building with straw. And I would say specifically, the eastern countries like Lithuania. And if you go to the west, where we are, then you have the French. And I'm trying to take their lead with what they're doing, broadcasting and promoting that message to the EU, because even though the UK may not be part of Europe, technically speaking, we do work with Europe. So there are broader messages that can be taken from all of that.
Is there a reason why France has a better grip on straw? building? Is it more to do just with the amount of land they have?
No, not necessarily. It goes back to what I was saying about the cultural aspects. The French have actually entrenched this methodology into their regulations. For example, there's a policy RE 2020, which is a new environmental regulation that came into effect in 2022 with the goal of improving energy efficiency and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the key aspects of that is that it's about promotion of low carbon and bio-based materials. We don't have that in the UK. And yes, there are groups in this country that are doing a very good job of delivering that message. So ACAN, for example, are really, really pushing on that, but we need much more.
So I am someone who really liked the idea of building with straw, but didn't. And it's hard to pinpoint exactly why I didn't, because I got all the, it's a natural material, low embodied carbon, it's a waste product. All of these things make sense, but I bet other people can almost align with me that you just get cultural baggage, whether it's the insurance aspect of it, the mortgage side of things. In my case, possibly even thinking about what my family might think of me. I know that sounds really silly. So can you relate to any of this? And how do you dispel these myths?
Well, yes, I can. I can certainly agree with all of those because when I explain to my family members, and I'm talking about not my immediate family members, I'm talking about distant relations about the work I'm doing, they go, "What? Building with straw? How do you do that?" And unfortunately, when you even talk about it to building contractors, the SMEs I'm referring to, the small, medium enterprises, some of them have absolutely no idea. But they, like you and like many others, are interested in doing it because it's a unique selling proposition, unique selling point. If you're doing something different to someone else and it benefits your customer, your clients, then you, as the provider of that solution, win. But for numerous reasons, people just don't understand it. It's kind of swept under the carpet. It need not be. I think the bigger message, and if we even go back further in this conversation, we're referring to the education of understanding how moisture travels around a room for the occupant, then I would say that the building contractor who's going to work on Mr. and Mrs. Jones's property, what he needs to do is just educate himself more. And in order for that to happen, there needs to be a very significant drive to enabling these people to understand how to do that. And that drive needs to come from the government.
I know we've had some examples that go possibly even centuries back, and a lot of straw building, it's how well it's maintained and how well it was built in the first place. But does it go wrong? Because I sensed this. I had a conversation with Tom Woolley, who loves natural materials, but he gave me this sort of mixed message that you've got to be careful with straw. So are we past that now?
I think it's like anything else. You've just got to be careful about how you apply it. So you want to work with someone who is experienced. And we have a number of people in this country who can do that. So it's not difficult at all. In fact, one of the main positives when you're building with bio-based materials, specifically straw in this instance, is that if you are already someone who is a plasterer or a carpenter, you can do this. It's not difficult. It's just using and applying a different material. The skills necessary are just the same as you would need if you were going to build a timber frame. It's exactly the same.
And is life getting easier when we're seeing more of these panelized systems that it's engineered and it just comes together quickly, and also you've got a higher performance at the end?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes, 100%. It's significantly easier. You can build a house assuming you've ordered your panels from your supplier, transport it over to your property, to your site, and you can build a house within a couple of weeks and even less time, perhaps. What we need to be doing is building more so with straw panels and developing factories. so that we have literally a conveyor belt of straw panels coming out. Because if you consider it also, it's what it does to the economy. We need more jobs. People need more jobs. And if we're saying that the construction sector is struggling, then what better way for a young person who has just left school and thinks, right, okay, what am I going to do with my life? I've got skills. I like doing a bit of plastering and decorating and stuff, but I don't really want to work with those materials that aren't aiding and assisting us to move forward in life. They're harming the planet. Work with straw panels. And it's up to the government to give the appropriate incentives to those large housing developers to incentivize them to build in that regard. And we can do this. We can do this. If they can do it in France, last year I was at a conference and the French were saying they've just built over 10,000 homes. I couldn't even tell you how many we have built in this country. And I'm not downplaying the efforts of those who are doing it in the UK.
What do you think is making the difference in the attitude of France? Is it just that culture and then it's naturally increasing because of the culture?
Yes, I really do feel that is the case. I think about a year ago, the farmers' union or the equivalent in France were livid at the conditions with which they were having to work under. And they went out and they protested, but they really went for it. Now, I'm not saying you go out and riot, but in this country, if there's an issue, the English especially, I'm English, I'm not Scottish or Welsh or Irish, but the English just kind of twiddle their thumbs and think, all right, it will pass over, or some smart politician or some smart business person will work it out. No, you can't rely on that. What you've got to do is, if this isn't good enough for you, then you've got to rally the troops or rally your community and say, right, what are we going to do about this? And really put pressure on the administration regarding that, or who can enable that and improve it to get them to make a difference. And it doesn't mean going on rallies and going on marches. It means doing it sensibly and intelligently. So addressing consultations, engaging in that kind of thing. If somebody's put out a survey, then engage in it. Don't just sit back and think someone else will do it, because it won't happen. And the French seem to have a very different mentality in that regard. For example, I mean, this group were celebrating the work that is going to come out through modern methods of construction. So panels were referred to just a moment ago. There is an alliance of housing associations and councils to come together with some building companies to work on a project. And it was costing something of the region of £800 million. Now that's positive, right? That's positive. And included within that group is Agile Homes. And Agile Homes are the people who developed mod cells, straw panels. So there is influence and there is a move towards that. But then you also hear modern methods of construction companies that had gone to the wall. Yes. So we have some mixed messages that are being delivered. Let's try to think positively. £800 million is not something to be sniffed at. That's quite a sum. Build on that positivity and see where that goes.
So housing activism, is there room for more? Now, if we wanted to become a housing activist, what would you say?
I would say speak to like-minded individuals. So if it's people in your local community, people who you trust, then engage with them. You never know who's on your doorstep. Get together, set up a group and work intelligently. We live in a digital lifestyle, to the point that, we can share ideas freely. You don't necessarily need to be an expert, but what I would always stress is to speak to the experts, speak to people who are qualified, suitably qualified, who think in the same way that you do. And they may not even think the same way that you do. You probably might find that some of them disagree fundamentally with your ideas, but sift through the ideas, sift through that network so that you can move forward with the plans that you were dreaming of and that you were thinking would make people's lives better.
And how do you think you're doing as a housing activist?
I think I'm doing quite a good job.
Good. I like it. Positive.
I think I'm keeping people's ideas and minds open to the solutions that are out there. I know that I wind quite a significant proportion of people out there, but I don't care. I'm just going to keep on going because what we're trying to do, certainly within Straw Bale UK, is to move and work with scale. So it's wonderful to have that grand designs idea of building your own single family property. That's great, and I have absolutely no problem with that whatsoever. But in order for us to live a healthier life, generally speaking, for all of us within civilization, then we need to be thinking of others too. And there are a proportion of people who are living, if we go back to what I was saying much earlier, on social housing estates, in properties that aren't suitable for them, and specifically for the wider society, because it affects your lives. If you are living in a damp and moldy property, let's say, for example, your mother and father, and you have a child who's aged 13 years or 14 years of age, that child will have friends at school, and they're really very reluctant to invite friends back to their home because of the state of their home. Now, what impact does that have on that child? The likelihood is that they will want to not be at home. They'll want to be out and perhaps be in the street. And that, in a sense, impacts society. And if there's nowhere to go to on the street, so there's no youth centre, what happens? We end up having antisocial behaviour. So if we bring it all back to home, there's no place like home, as Dorothy would say from The Wizard of Oz, then you've got to look after number one. And we've got to come together to enable that.
Now, are you doing all of this in your free time, or is some of this bringing in an income? It's a challenging thing that I know in my own world as well. I sometimes think, what am I doing? There's so much trying to get the message out there. So how does it work for you?
Well, I work with the Sustainable Traditional Building Alliance, and I also have my own private consultancy work, which I do. But a significant proportion of my time is voluntary, but that won't be the case for much longer. It's because, again, I go back to the culture of where we are. It's a case of going out and ensuring that the right message is delivered to those companies and those organizations so that you or I can get that work, and there are organizations that out there that want it. So yes, voluntary and salaried consultancy work, both are working hand in hand.
Well, keep up the good work. And do you think there's ever a chance that you might get yourself in a straw building?
Yes, I would like that. I would like that very much. I think you and I both, our paths cross regarding music at some point. I would love very much to set up my own studio. To be honest with you, that was one of the initial ideas that I had, to set up a home and have a studio on that site. So in the future, yeah, I'd love to do that. I'd love to do that.
And how do you want to wrap up this conversation? Is there a final message of your activism?
I think the overriding message I would love to give to your listeners is to keep an open mind to bio-based materials. Let's look at scaling up this material, because it's brilliant. It will enhance all of our lives, and from all of the data and all of the reports that I've seen, people who live in straw buildings or in bio-based buildings tend to be happier and healthier.
Yeah, I always think they have a nice feeling as well. It's a hard one
Yes,
to describe, but they do.
yes,
Cypren, lovely to
yes.
catch up. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me. You take care.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session, houseplanninghelp.com/365. You can review the main information once again in our summary. We've got some images as well of those great bio-based projects. If you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, you can do that within the show notes or on social media. And of course, we will link you to Cypren, to the European Straw Building Association, Strawbell UK, and the Sustainable Traditional Building Alliance. houseplanninghelp.com/365. My call to action is to check out the Hub. This is the membership community that we run alongside House Planning Help, giving you further assistance. For example, we've just had another Ask the Expert session with Ez Trezida. He's a regular. Every few months we get him in to answer building physics questions, also retrofit questions, moisture risk, all that sort of thing. It's always interesting to see what crops up. Sometimes we go back around. So if you're planning a high performance home, can you put in a wood burner, particularly if you've got a plentiful supply of wood on your doorstep?
People sometimes have the impression that you can't put a wood burning stove in a passive house. Yeah, absolutely you can. It's been done many times. But most people who've done it in a passive house would, if they had their time again, would not bother to do it, because they find that they use it very infrequently and that the comfort is very good without the stove anyway. So they don't really miss not using it. And it takes up space and they're expensive, and it introduces a whole load of complications in terms of air tightness. Even if you've got good air tightness, there's always a background heat loss because you've got this flue that's always losing heat, even if it's insulated. I would also question this idea of the wood being free. Even if you're not paying for it, you're likely to be doing quite a lot of work in terms of harvesting it, drying it, stacking it, and then cleaning up after using it. So there is a kind of hidden cost there to using it. And more insidiously, there's an impact on your indoor air quality. That's an impact potentially on your health. If you live in an area where there are other buildings, it's an impact on the health of the people who live near you. So there are definitely costs, even if you're not paying for the wood with money.
And then we can add in the carbon cost. And our conversation rumbled on. You can check out the full Ask the Expert session along with all the other questions in the Hub archive. What is the Hub? Well, it's our way of trying to simplify the self-build journey if you're building a new home, or helping you along the way with a retrofit. Just giving you that ability to get your questions answered, to access information about the process so that you know what's coming next in our courses, our live training sessions with guest experts on different topics. You can chat with me every week in office hour and get my input. We've also got our members only forum, and of course our in-depth video case studies where we've spent a lot of time on particular projects, but trying to draw out all the decisions that have been made on those projects. So go and take a look, houseplanninghelp.com/join for more information. Next time, Howard Johns from 10 is my guest. We look at their home energy transformation using solar PV, batteries, insulation and heat pumps. Thank you so much for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.